All right, everyone, thanks again for joining us today for the RCR Wireless News NFV Service Orchestration webinar. My name is Dan Meyer, I'm Editor-in-Chief here at RCR Wireless News. Today's one-hour webinar, we plan on going over the interesting topic of service orchestration and how it's impacting the telecom market. Joining us today on the panel will be Burj Ibazian, who's a Senior Analyst and Consultant at Wireless 2020. Also, we'll be joined by Michael Howe, who's a Senior Product Line Manager at Ixia, and Alistair Scott, who's a Director in the CTO office at JDSU. The plan for today's one-hour webinar is to initially go over some results and some findings from a report we're putting out. I'm just going to put that there. Next one there. Okay. Putting out a new report looking at the NFV service orchestration space. That report should be on our website here either later on today or first thing tomorrow. Then we'll bring on Burj, who will provide a bit of an analyst overview of the current NFV and service orchestration market. We'll then talk a bit with Michael Howe and Alistair Scott to get their perspectives from their companies on the market. After that, we plan on having a quick roundtable discussion amongst the four of us. And then after that, also take some questions from those of you who are listening in. If you do have any questions for our panel members, please feel free to use the questions tab there on the GoToWebinar control panel. And if you have any specific questions for any specific panel member, please put their name in the question as well. The plan is to spend the last 10 or 15 minutes or so on those questions. And the questions that we don't get to during the webinar, we will also be sharing them with the panel members for potential follow-up after the webinar. All right, and obviously for audio issues, hopefully we will try to speak as loudly and clearly as possible. But if you can't hear us too well, also please try checking your speaker settings on your computer. All right, well, to get started, here's a quick little synopsis here about RCR Wireless News. We've been covering the wireless communication space for quite some time. Before there was actually commercial services, and have been following a lot of the latest trends in the space, including the move towards virtualization. All right, well, now this webinar is kind of tied to a report, or longer story, I should say, coming out from us on the topic of orchestration in the telecom space. Like I said earlier, that report should be available on our website here, hopefully later on today or first thing tomorrow, so please feel free to check that out. Well, looking at the orchestration space, one thing we noticed, or at least I noticed when putting together the story and speaking with a lot of different people on the topic, was that orchestration is obviously maybe perhaps a new term for a lot of people in the telecom market. It seemed like the different people I talked to on the topic, there seemed to be a different, meaning to different people on it, which is kind of interesting to hear. Whether I was talking to telecom operators, to analysts, or to vendors in the space, it seemed like everybody had a bit of a different take on what they thought service orchestration or service orchestration was. And obviously through this webinar, I'm sure we'll get some more details on that from our panel members as well. Here's a quick slide I'm sure a lot of you have seen if you've at all looked into the orchestration space, kind of looking at where orchestration fits into the whole virtualization schematic. As you see, the orchestration part of it's on the right-hand side. They're kind of controlling the operations between the NFV platforms and also VNF. So orchestration obviously is a major part of the orchestration of the virtualization move by telecom operators. When I was talking to people about this, one thing that kind of came up a lot was, the importance of service orchestration for telecom operators moving forward. A few of the analysts I spoke with had mentioned that orchestration could be a potential choke point for the deployment of virtualized services, as operators are going to need these platforms, these orchestration platforms, to really tie together their legacy systems, which are currently operating very well and generating billions of dollars worth of revenue, and this new move towards virtualization, which is a way for them to garner more efficiencies from those networks. And so it's going to be really key for these service orchestration platforms to tie together these two disparate networks in a very seamless way, to not obviously to not impact current systems, but also to allow the operators to be more efficient in rolling out new services to counteract the over-the-top and different competitive players coming to the telecom space. Nice quote here from someone who, on the report, kind of just looking at where we are in the telecom environment. The key to this, I thought, was the last part of the quote there, where it says, "Orchestration holds the key to breaking this barrier, allowing changes to be implemented quickly to reflect the dynamic nature of the service." So again, there's a lot of thought here that the orchestration part of this is going to be a very key aspect as operators roll out the virtualized platforms to really take advantage of these new services that they can start rolling out quickly and more efficiently onto their networks. One thing we looked at is, I guess, the need for service orchestration. Kind of as I mentioned, obviously, as operators are rolling out these new services, they need a way to manage the interaction between these new operations and their legacy services. One of the telecom operators I spoke with mentioned that for them it was a gateway to a tighter coupling between network and cloud deployments for their network. So obviously tapping into the cloud platform as well is a big part of orchestration. A lot of the companies I talked to also mentioned the operating efficiencies that can be used to take advantage of virtualized services, and so obviously orchestration is a big part of tapping into those efficiencies, and also the greater agility in the face of OTT competitors in this space. A lot of people also mentioned the fact that legacy systems that are out there now are going to be in place for quite some time. Obviously these are systems that are working very well today. Operators have spent tens of hundreds of billions of dollars on these networks that are operating today and supporting services, and so the chances of those going away tomorrow are pretty slim. Some people thought that we were looking at either 5, maybe even 10 years of continued support for these legacy systems, and so and maybe even longer for some parts of the network. And so obviously to have a platform in place to orchestrate between the new virtualized platforms and these legacy systems is going to be very important for telecom operators going into at least the mid and maybe even longer term. One thing that was also brought up was that the fact that service orchestration and obviously virtualization in general is really being driven by carriers. Unlike some past technologies that have been brought to market, this move towards virtualization is really seen as a carrier-driven move, which I'm guessing for vendors out there is probably a good thing to have, as opposed to in the past where they were perhaps trying to knock on doors, trying to sell equipment. Now it's they're having carriers come to them saying, hey, we need this stuff out there. And so it's definitely a different dynamic out there in the marketplace. And one of the initial pushes for orchestration was said to be in the OSS BSS space, where obviously operators are looking to tap into their support systems that they already have in place to support these new services. Without the ability to bill or to provide customer service for these new systems, there's definitely a chance for failure there for garnering new revenues from the new systems. So that was a big part of the initial push for orchestration. All right. Now, obviously, some of the challenges, this is something that I'm sure we'll talk with a bit of the panel members a little bit later on as well. But this is something I know I talked with a lot of people about, and these were some of the key issues going forward with this. Obviously, standards and interoperability are two key parts of this. ETSI is seen as the key driver when it comes to standards in the virtualization space and for orchestration. But there was some concern about the speed at which ETSI is moving in terms of getting standards out there. Obviously, the market is going really quickly in this space, perhaps even a little ahead of what ETSI is able to do. So there's a bit of push and pull here when it comes to working with a certain standard in terms of service orchestration. Obviously, too, there's issues with vendors interpreting what's being put out there when it comes to the service orchestration standards or at least guidelines that are out there right now too. So people are putting different twists on their interpretation of standards, which could down the road perhaps cause a little bit of issues. But again, I'm sure we'll get some more insight from that from our panel members as well. Also, OpenStack is a big part of this service orchestration. OpenStack is a relatively established standard that's been used for quite some time in the data center space, but it's still somewhat new to the telecom space, and so there's still a bit of getting familiar with OpenStack from a telecom perspective as opposed to a data center perspective. Obviously, and also, vendors are doing some a unique twist on things, but also operators are asking for their own unique implementations at times when it comes to service orchestration, and so that's also challenging vendors in terms of how they're implementing their own platforms. And I guess at the end of it, it seemed like the main source for all this is that the need to remain open as a market to find its footing in terms of service orchestration. Obviously, we're still a bit early in the phase in the service orchestration space, and so it's still a key for vendors and for carriers to really remain open to perhaps changing maybe some of their views on how this is going to all be rolled out until there's a little more solid footing in the marketplace for this. That's the main overview of the report that we have coming out. Again, you can check out that report on our website later on today or first thing tomorrow for some more details on that. But with that, I want to now bring on the panel members to provide their insight into the market as well. So first, I want to bring on Burj Avazian, who's with Wireless 2020, to provide his insight on the market. Hey, Burj, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. I enjoyed working with you when you developed your first coverage, and I look forward to seeing the next one.
Very good.
In my presentation, I kind of overlap with you a bit as far as introduction, but I'm going to try and focus in on the role that service orchestration will play not only in the transition to NFV and SDN and cloud, but really in monetizing and creating a business case that justifies the investment associated with that. So I'll try and pick up where you left off and go from there. Is that all right, Dan?
That sounds perfect.
All right, well then why don't you advance my slide so we can get started.
All right.
So, you know, when you think about NFV and SDN, and if you're an industry analyst, you tend to have a view that, you know, SDN and NFV have been gaining momentum among mobile operators especially, and I tend to cover the wireless industry more than wireline. And you're right, the opportunity is there to improve service agility, and the hope, the desire is with that to generate new revenue streams, combat the OTTs, or at least maybe usurp them and bring their value into the revenue of the operator, and reduce total cost of network ownership and operation. But at the same time, you know, these are early days and new technologies, new architectures, and virtualized networks are presenting new challenges that service operators are not fully prepared to face in terms of service management and operations. So architecturally, they've got all the chartware, and they certainly have enough vendors supporting them on the hardware side. The difficulty then is to map all the services to the right OSS, BSS solutions that allow them to then function in terms of service creation, delivery, assurance, all the virtualized services that they want to offer. You know, the network control layers are becoming increasingly complex, and they comprise a disparate range of legacy and SDN controllers, DNF managers, cloud and data center orchestration platforms. It's a complex environment. You need to deal with what the legacy offers as well as where you're headed in the new arena. So orchestration then, end-to-end orchestration then allows you to manage across these domains. Let's go to the next slide. So you look at where orchestration fits in, it's kind of this higher level oversight above the SDN and NFV activities that provides the automation, provisioning, interworking of both physical and virtual resources so that the benefits of NFV and SDN can be fully realized. And, you know, we kind of understand why we're going toward NFV and SDN. The difficulty is really deriving the full benefits once we get there. And service orchestration is intended to make sure that investment is really going to be beneficial to the operator. So, as I said, you know, you can certainly do, you know, the basics of implementing NFV, particularly separating and virtualizing your equipment architecture. But the real challenge is how to quickly introduce and operationalize new services while you're transitioning to NFV. If you're going to benefit from this so-called agility, then you need to be able to have new services quickly introduced and generate revenue quickly. The challenge is keeping the complexity and cost under control while you're managing and implementing NFV and SDN. So what's happening really is that today the overall cost and complexity are being amplified by the fact that hardware-based appliances that are dedicated to performing a single function in network have short life cycles. They consume large amounts of power and space. And so we're moving toward this pooling environment. And certainly, Dan, you referenced the fact that the NFV architecture provided a framework, a reference architecture, to provide guidelines on how these elements will interact. Go on to the next slide.
All right.
As much as all that's true, and we certainly have, you know, a management and orchestration framework, a MANO framework, that allows orchestration to play a key role in the definition and deployment of NFV-based services. And MANO will specify the management orchestration not only of, the virtual machines and the VNFs, more importantly, of the cloud resources that the services will reside on. But the real key is how then does that tie to the OSS, BSS, and the revenue-generating functions of the operator, and help them justify NFV through a business case analysis. So with that, can you go to the last slide? At Wireless 2020, which is a boutique consulting firm I'm now a partner in, we've developed a YROI tool that allows operators to help fine-tune the business case for NFV. And we've been applying this business case tool to each of the key areas in which virtualization is being introduced into their networks. This particular slide is focused a bit on the RAN, the radio access network, where we're seeing baseband pooling and the centralized RAN emerging as the way operators want to initially implement NFV in a RAN environment. And this tool allows them to look at not only the cost of the transition to a centralized RAN or a cloud RAN, but more importantly, what that enables as far as the benefits that they'll derive in terms of the agility and the new services they'll be able to offer as a result. So it's a comprehensive tool that looks at both cost and revenue and generates an ROI calculation. And this has become very beneficial to the operators that are moving down this road. We're going to expand on this platform and make it more applicable to the cloud arena, to other aspects of NFV and SDN. And it will continue to help operators then look at the return on investment they get for moving toward and into NFV. So with that, I'd like to hand off to the rest of the panelists, if that's okay.
Sounds great. Thanks, Burge. We definitely appreciate the insight there, and obviously we'll come back to you when we get to the roundtable part of the discussion here. I also want to remind those of you who are listening in on this that if you have any questions for our panel members, to please use the questions tab there on the GoToWebinar control panel. You can send those questions in, and the plan is to use the last part of the webinar to go over some of those questions. If you have any specific questions for specific panel members, please feel free to put their name in the question as well. But and with that, we will go to we'll bring on Michael Howe, who is the product marketing director at Ixia. Michael, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Hi, Dan. Thank you very much, and thank you for all the attendees making some time today. If you can move on to the next slide there.
Sure.
So I've been playing around in this space since 2011. I serve as the chair of the Testing Interop Working Group at the ONF, so very heavily been involved with SDN. And then through Ixia, I work on ETSI efforts, specifically some of the proof of concept tests that have been done, and most recently working within the OP-NFV organization. So I built this little kind of wireline document or diagram to show you what I would consider the end vision of the carrier, which is that they have, applications that can feed down into an orchestration layer. That orchestration layer could talk to resources in the data center and provision things like a virtual machine and as well as provision the required networking technology. Many of those things kind of exist today because we've leveraged technology from the IT cloud. So from the clouds that Amazon and Rackspace and others have built, we're really trying to leverage a lot of those technologies that exist. So the hypervisor technology exists, things like OpenStack for provisioning and management exist. The main difference here is that for telco services and network function virtualization, we can't just use the clouds that exist today. The main difference is that when you virtualize applications and you just spin up a VM to run an application, you can allocate memory and CPU, and that will service the application generally well. When you look at network function virtualization, you're really looking at input and output requirements, and you're kind of bound by performance of what that virtual router or virtual firewall might need. So it gets a lot more complex, and that's why there's a lot of movement to progress this forward. But just moving forward on this wireline document, thank you for advancing. You can actually advance one more. If you look at the role of orchestration, you're talking about provisioning VM, provisioning network connectivity, whatever required storage. But in addition to spinning up a service, you then have to monitor and manage the service. You have to integrate with the OSS and BSS for billing, as well as element management, things like that. One particular interesting part here where, let's say, NFV orchestration and SDN can kind of interwork here is most carriers are investing in SDN and want to have an SDN strategy. That's where you see this kind of network controller layer. And the network controller layer is primarily built to talk to the network elements. I think the feeling of most carriers is that with an SDN controller is built for the advanced network functions that I require. If I rely on an orchestration layer, like let's say I'm using OpenStack, I'd have to build a lot of complexity and feature set into something like the Neutron plugin. So it may make sense to kind of have a separate dedicated layer for talking to the network. So what it does exist today, and can you go back one second? What a lot of folks have rolled out is the controller layers is talking to the data center and provisioning overlay networks in the data center. What's not really there today is the other side of the network diagram, where the controllers are provisioning connectivity across the WAN and the access and the wireless. Next slide, please.
All right.
So how are companies getting started with this? With the equipment manufacturers, many of them are moving from their traditional appliances and developing VNFs, so they're virtualizing their network function. And they're needing to validate that network function on various compute platforms. They need to know, will it have predictable performance? And the only way to do that many times is by fine-tuning that compute platform. From the service provider standpoint, they're looking at proof of concepts and looking like, hey, can I roll out a virtual EPC project? Can I spin up a virtual a CPE project? So they're looking at specific use cases. How Ixia fits into this and the way we're helping is, many folks know us for our physical testers that now can connect to the NICs of these virtualized systems and test kind of from the bottom up. So baseline the NIC, baseline up to through the hypervisor to the vSwitch, and actually even spin and test all the way up to a virtual network function. The challenge with this is that these pods of physical resources are kind of limited. So oftentimes the VNFs, for example, are developed purely in software and on shared resources. So many times you gotta roll your testing into the virtual space. So if you want to do functional testing of a VNF or some various performance testing, that's why Ixia has virtualized the majority of our offerings, from IX Network for Layer 2, Layer 3, IX Load for Layer 4, Layer 7, Breaking Point for security testing, IX Chariot as a lightweight endpoint for testing, and even a virtual tap technology. Next slide, please. So how does this all fit together? If you look at orchestration, kind of moving from the lab to live, you can go ahead and step through the build out all the way through. But essentially, you're looking at the orchestrator to spin up your resources. And the complexity here also is you may have virtual functions, and also you may need to talk to physical functions. The orchestrator is then talking to a network controller. An example is something like Open Daylight as an SDN controller has a OpenStack plugin for Neutron, so you can talk through a Neutron interface and provision the required networking. You can keep building it out, please, Dan. So that will provision the network path. All right. So now you've deployed your virtual network functions. You've tied them together with required networking, essentially building a service chain. And then you really need to consider having a test cycle to ensure what you spun up is going to deliver the performance or functionality that you expect. And so we're really kind of talking to our customers about ingraining orchestration in the lab, as well as when you go to live networks, ingraining test technology into the orchestration so that when you spin up a service or make a change to a service, you can do a service assurance and service monitoring and verify that service has been provisioned correctly. So we wrote a bit of a book that helps people kind of ramp up on this technology. That ebook is available for a free download. You can check it out on our NFV portal there. So with that, I'll turn it back to the panel. Thank you, Dan.
Great. Thanks, Mike. We definitely appreciate the insight there. Sorry for the slides mixing up there, but we appreciate the great insight on that there. And obviously, we'll bring you back on for some discussion here in a little bit. All right. With that, I'm going to now bring on Alistair Scott with JDSU. I know Alistair to provide some insight on their view, JDSU's view in the orchestration space.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks. So if we jump into the next slide. So just to kick off here, so JDSU, in the test segment, JDSU covers a few different business areas, but around communications testing, essentially two main focus for our portfolio. The first one is the field portable instruments. So a lot of technicians out in the field doing broadband turn up, fiber turn up, service turn up in customer prem environments, for example, or troubleshooting networks use these devices. The other side is the Excite portfolio that we have, which is more core assurance systems, which monitor at the service platform level. So the IMS service, EPC services for wireline, mobile, and video services. So that's a distributed real-time monitoring system that we have. So the two, up to this point, have largely existed somewhat separately. Going forward with virtualization, there's a lot of opportunities to leverage the capabilities of a core platform with an edge field test instrument to be able to provide more functionality to the field engineers and more visibility into the system overall. From a segment focus, we cover most of the network segments right from cloud and enterprise side with data centers, mobile fixed broadband networks, and we're looking at virtualization pretty much across the board, whether it's all the way from virtualized CPE for customer prem equipment and service virtualization, all the way up into hosted service components in the data center. So the area where we're working, we've been involved in virtualization for several years. We looked at virtualizing many of our service assurance products back in the early 2000s when the Intel hardware became viable to host those virtual machine concepts, and started with bare metal and moving into virtual machines. So that's been moving for a while. What we've been doing most recently with around NFV and orchestration is getting involved in both the ETSI and Telemanagement Forum groups to look at how we can add that assurance and test capability and make sure that that's represented for the NFV standards. And we've been involved in several proof of concepts as those evolve, as well as the standards are evolving. So we'll go into a little more detail on those in one of the later slides. The next two steps are really looking at how virtualization and orchestration are going to be introduced into the network. And the first part is really enabling it so that it can be introduced, and normal processes for activating and testing services as they're brought up, as well as the performance monitoring and then troubleshooting of those services once they're in production. The dynamic nature of virtualization, in particular with orchestration, introduces some new challenges. Some of those Mike touched on in the last section. But essentially the fact that components can be reconfigured on the fly, they can move around within the network where they're hosted from server to server. So some of these cloud concepts that are coming into the network that really haven't existed from a kind of classic carrier infrastructure where it's been fairly static from that point of view. So there's some challenges there that are need to be addressed. And then in the longer term, looking at network optimization, looking at how the network itself can be optimized. One of the key benefits in terms of cost of ownership or cost of operations for a virtualized and orchestrated network is really being able to not just introduce new services rapidly, but also optimize the service delivery completely and the utilization level of that network. And so that's the longer term. We're engaged in some projects there that we'll go into a little more detail. So if we move ahead. So just real quick on this one. This is at the top of this slide is essentially how services are designed and then brought into a catalog, and then can be instantiated on a service basis, per customer basis. What we're looking at here is adding in the performance characteristics of that service in as part of that service recipe, so that the SLA levels, for example, and how that service should be monitored and tested get built in right up in at the service description. And then as the service is orchestrated, those components for monitoring and test can then be orchestrated in a natural fashion as well. So this is the first area in terms of how do we get an orchestrated network brought up to a similar level where it's maybe still got some non-orchestrated physical components to it, as well as virtual components, and being able to test those in a normal manner and keep that consistent if the network's reconfigured. If we move to the next slide. So this is a project that's more forward-looking, and this is all about the cost optimization of a network. And it's using the fact that once you have that orchestration capability, we can take real-time data on the quality of service and utilization of the network, along with some other business parameters, to then guide policy and how the network itself should be optimized. So this is a Catalyst project that we're working. It's sponsored by AT&T and NTT. We're working with Ericsson, Area Networks, and Microsoft in that. And the role that JDSU is providing is the real-time collection and mediation of that network quality data and utilization data using our Excite platform to deliver that up, so that the optimization layer can make decisions based on current state of the network. And this is all about understanding how to drive the network to a higher level of utilization, but also placement decisions, taking both quality of service and cost inputs into that decision on where to deploy a particular network function versus one location versus another. So that's where JDSU's been involved in both of these kind of shorter term enabling the virtualization shift, and longer term looking at how orchestration can be used to really optimize the network as well.
Great. All right. I also definitely appreciate the insight there. But again, I wanted to, I guess, do a quick panel discussion on some of these topics. And obviously, you guys brought up a lot of interesting parts of what's happening in the market right now. I know, Burj, we had talked initially when I started on this story, and one thing you had mentioned that, when at the recent, or I guess not so recent anymore, but the Mobile World Congress event there in Barcelona, you had mentioned that, a lot of the companies you were talking to, that service orchestration was a big part of the discussion, especially around virtualization. And I guess, from what you kind of saw there, what you've been seeing over the past couple of months, I guess, where would you say we are in terms of this move towards service orchestration? Obviously, virtualization is a process that everybody seems to be moving towards. That doesn't seem like that's a question anymore. But I guess, where do you see us in the process of actually implementing those virtualized platforms, and then obviously orchestrating them with a service orchestration platform? What's your view of where we are perhaps today in that process?
So I think we've come a long way. Service orchestration has emerged as not only the key ingredient that really will make an NFV network virtualization implementation successful, but even more importantly, it's now become the lead function, so that companies who are moving the industry fast in this direction have positioned service orchestration as their real value-added offering. So let's take an example. At NEC, they have all the different hardware units are virtualizing, and all the different elements of the network resources that they bring to bear are being virtualized. But above that, they are leading that whole capability with Netcracker, which is their OSS/BSS company, which is functioning as the orchestration layer and the orchestrator for these NFV initiatives. So that is an example, and I think we're going to see more and more other companies taking the same approach, where at Ericsson, for example, you would expect the software side of Ericsson to lead their NFV initiatives with an orchestrator capability, and help the industry move more quickly and seamlessly through this process. It'll help, I think, with all of these testing and verification, the service introductions. All of this will be a lot more implemented a lot more smoothly when we position orchestration as the primary initiative.
Very interesting. Yeah, that's a good point. I know some of the companies I talked to, both wireline and wireless side for the story, they'd mentioned that, obviously vendors now have to come to them with a virtualized, I guess at least a roadmap for virtualization. But even more importantly, if they don't have a service orchestration aspect of that, it's pretty hard to get their foot in the door. So it seems like the vendor, or at least the operators, are really pretty much requiring at least some sort of at least roadmap, if not an actual product that they can use in terms of bringing their services into the carrier. So it's definitely seems like it's changed quite a bit, and it seems like every week there's something new popping up on this. So I'm sure it's changing a lot there. Well, I guess maybe Michael, what are you guys seeing? Obviously, when you talk to your customers, how important is it to have this orchestration, I guess, platform in place for them? Are you seeing? Are they at a point now where they're they notice and they need to have that in place before they really move forward with any sort of broader virtualization plans?
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. I think that the real trend we've seen is from 2012, when the ETSI white paper was produced, really kind of banding the carriers together to really push this movement towards virtualization. Most of the effort has been on the vendors are virtualizing their functions, as you've been hearing about, and the infrastructure has been developing. As the infrastructure of the hypervisors and vSwitch, many of these things, are kind of open source projects and enterprise grade. Or you go with something like VMware, right? So something like VMware gives you high quality and a fully packaged solution, including all the way to vCloud Director, which is a full orchestrator. But carriers really want to build on, open source platforms and are not locked in. And so, as the VN, on the NEM side, they're evolving the VNFs to run on these virtualized platforms. The carrier focus has shifted really from 2014, when in December of 2014 the ETSI specification for MANO came out. And this was really a big move because this MANO document is really significant. It's 185 or so pages, and it defines very explicit interfaces and functions. So now everyone's working to ensure that their VNF can be talked to by a VNF manager. The infrastructure can be talked to from a virtual infrastructure manager. So there's these standardized interfaces that are being worked out. It is a little bit in the early phase, and as I talked to my bit a little bit, is that the provisioning is there. A lot of these things, again, leveraged from existing OpenStack technologies. However, the real limitation is if I'm deploying a router and I need very specific performance, and I need something like CPU pinning of my virtual router to explicit cores on a socket, that really wasn't there, right? So deployment of a virtual network function is different than just deployment of a VM to run an application on. And so there's kind of movement. If you look at the last release of OpenStack, it was Juno. It's 10th release, so it's pretty mature software. But now all these new requirements are coming into OpenStack for NFV. So there's work around intelligent workload placement and others. And so I think we're really seeing this the requirement boom. Also, carriers want a standard way to interface the equipment in the network. So there's a big push for netconf interfaces to the equipment and leveraging Yang data models. And so you're beginning to see a bit of a standardization because the carriers want a multi-vendor network, and they want standard interfaces to the vendors, and they want open and shared APIs and data models. And so I think I'd say from 2014 on, the real focus is on management and orchestration.
Got it. Okay. Well, maybe I guess, Alistair, maybe taking off from that point there. How important do you see this move towards? Obviously, open source is a big part of this. Standards are a big part of this. Obviously, like Michael was saying, operators want to have standards in place that allow them to tap into a multi-vendor environment here. I guess, how do you see the progress of that part of this moving forward? I mean, there's lots of documents out there, a lot of organizations working on this. What's your view of how that part is I guess, evolving with what seems to be a very rapid movement towards virtualization?
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of acceleration. I think some of the key programs like NFV, where they're developing actual code to provide a reference implementation, and I think some of that work is going to proceed faster than maybe some of the interface, detailed interface specifications on the ETSI side. So I think that will help a lot in terms of both technically proving out the capacity and some of the fundamental questions about how much throughput can a given component provide. But it'll also provide essentially de facto reference implementation of some of those components as well. So I think that as NFV starts to gain momentum, then I think that will have a big effect. NFV is very focused at the lower levels right now, and moving up the stack more into the MANO, the orchestration layers further down the road. So I think some of that is still work to do. There's still, we shouldn't forget the needs of telecom and getting to what might be called carrier grade components here, where some of the things like upgradability of OpenStack and some of these other fundamental needs of these critical building blocks are rapidly getting added, but these are, before production can really take place in some of these environments, some of these more fundamental issues are need to be addressed, and they're being worked on, and good progress being made there. And I think what I like is they're pushing those improvements into the upstream code base so that they benefit not just the carriers that are using them. They're not creating a fragmented development base for some of these open source components. They're actually improving it for everybody. So I think that those building blocks, as they mature, will have a big improvement. One of the other things that I think is, in the cloud world, they try to abstract components and manage them all through consistent and common APIs to get the economies of scale. Within telecoms, there's with the high data plane needs and latency criticalities, there's sometimes needs for specific hardware dependencies to go into the virtual functions. And we're starting to see with things like the enhanced platform awareness capabilities of being able to say, you need a particular hardware function for this virtual function to be able to run efficiently or to specification. And those are, those need to be implemented at a low level, not just at the hardware supporting the feature, but also in the kind of model and descriptor level up at the top level, and the orchestrator and everything in between. So we're starting to see those, maturing and becoming available as well. And those are other critical building blocks to get the performance out of the virtual functions.
Yeah, great point. Obviously, the carrier grade aspect of this is a big part. As I know, some of the operators I was talking to for the story, that was still, I think they're over the concern there, but that was something they brought up, is that the IT and the data center space is perhaps a little bit different from the telecom operator space in terms of what they need for requirements. And obviously, that's something that the virtualization and service orchestration vendors, I know you guys are working on as well, but that's something you guys, I'm sure, are seeing, is that there are different requirements for telecom operators as opposed to perhaps some of the other people who are using OpenStack and different versions of software like that for their data center needs. So it's a big part of this. So I think I want to bring up another point too, and with Burj on this. Burj, you kind of, I know you showed that model that Wireless 2020 uses, kind of the ROI aspect of this, and that was kind of something that was brought up too. Is it seems like still, even with virtualization, that there's still perhaps a questionable, not a questionable business model, but I guess ways to present the business models to the people in charge and operators who are actually writing the checks for this. I guess, are you guys seeing more interest from maybe some of your customers and some of the carriers you're working with trying to come up with an actual model that shows that this move towards virtualization is something that can pay off, or is that still something that perhaps is not? We're not quite to that point yet where the payoff model needs to be shown yet.
No, we're seeing tremendous interest in the YROI business modeling tool platform for NFV, and it's primarily because there is so much uncertainty related to this movement, and there are a lot of moving parts, there are a lot of elements that are involved, and there's a lot of risk here to be managed. I mean, operators like AT&T have worked through the requirements and have made NFV part of their procurement process.
Mm-hmm.
And they have made this a priority, so all of their vendors are required to not only have a roadmap, but more importantly, to be at the leading edge and be part of the ecosystem that's taking them down this road. But at the same time, they need to understand how this affects their ability to compete over a 10-year period as this transition occurs. So our tool allows them to have a 10-year business case that allows the NFV transition to be highlighted and to show both the cost side in terms of savings as well as the new revenues that can be brought on board to show the full ROI impact. And there's a lot of interest in all that from the operator side.
Very interesting, very interesting. Okay, all right, that makes sense. Well, I wanted to, I think we have about 15 minutes left here. I wanted to make sure we get to some of the questions that were coming in. We do have a couple questions that have come in, so I want to make sure we get to those. And we do have a question here from someone, from Diego Pereira. It says, looks like it's targeted for Alistair. You talked about optimization parameters in the network, but this is a huge task, complex interdependent networks, lots of parameters. Does JDSU have any plans of developing methods like data analytic engines or machine learning algorithms to solve this challenge?
Yeah, so maybe the best way to address that, what we've done in the project with the other partners, we introduced area networks, for example, to bring in network capacity modeling into that so that the policy could essentially be informed from that. One of the topics that we're concerned about is you don't want to have just a threshold-based policy model to trigger changes in the network and maybe move a virtual function from one location to another, because the bandwidth effect of that elsewhere might be detrimental. So being able to actually model future state and see is that an improvement versus current state, and actually have some evaluation and attenuation on that process. So that, as that project progresses, we're gradually introducing more of the kind of predictive analytics and that modeling capability into it. What we've been doing in the project up to this point is starting to identify some of the key business factors that would influence not just the technical factors, but also some of the cost drivers as well, for location of a particular virtual function or more instances of a virtual function, and enabling that cost aspect to be included in the network optimization process.
Got it. Okay. All right. Sounds good. Another question came in here, and this one I might direct towards Michael, put him on the spot a little bit. Someone's asking about would using Tosca as the OpenStack template language for NFV have some benefits over Heat or Yang? So I don't know, Michael, if you have any insight there on the template language there for OpenStack.
Yeah, I'll quickly comment on it. I tried to answer it online. I'm not sure what happened there, but my response is, like, I haven't heard many requirements for Tosca. What I have been hearing more and more about is there's a lot of interest in Heat templates, which are Heat is the orchestration component of OpenStack, and what it allows you to do is define the VMs as well as the required networking that you need, and you can provision it much more simply. So I think Heat is there's a lot of momentum being around it in terms of simplifying the complexity of the deployment, especially when you have multiple VMs and maybe some complex interconnectivity requirements. When it comes to netconf and Yang is really a data model, like where you'd have a published data model. So if a service provider wants to configure a given network element, they can talk to it via the netconf language, and they could configure it and provision it based on the Yang data model. And so usually the workflow is you deploy and then you configure. And so more like Heat is, if it's a OpenStack-oriented deployment, a Heat template could be leveraged, and then you interact with those devices via netconf using a Yang data model to get them configured. So that's the way I'm seeing a lot of requirements going. I haven't heard really hardly anything about Tosca as a template language.
Okay, all right, that sounds good. I think I answered that question pretty well. Well, we got one final question here for now. And this one here, actually, I was going to kind of bring up as perhaps a final question for all the panel members as well. And since we're about 10 minutes to the end of the webinar. Maybe we'll just bring this up now as a kind of final wrap-up question for everybody involved. But someone's asking about what are the biggest challenges operators are facing when deploying NFV and SDN, and I guess I'd probably add to that a little bit as well as, maybe even the next step of deploying service orchestration in terms of NFV and SDN deployments. So maybe start with Burj on kind of a wrap-up, looking, I guess, what would you see as being maybe the biggest challenges operators are facing as they make this move towards not just NFV and SDN, but also deploying service orchestration platforms onto their network?
So most operators, particularly the mobile operators that I work with, maintain multi-vendor environments in which they have to balance not only the hardware vendor community, but as well a variety of software and platform service providers that they interact with, they work with, and there's different paces by which they're moving toward virtualization, and the different approaches they're taking. So they have to figure out how to drive this process that's in an operator-centric manner rather than in a vendor-centric manner. And that really relies on service orchestration as the vehicle to do that, to accomplish that, and to make sure that their OSS, BSS platforms evolve at the same time. So maintaining that ability to monetize services and test and provision while they're going through this transition is the biggest challenge.
Very interesting. Yeah, that's a good point. I think the people I talked to as well, it seemed like what they were kind of looking at as well. So I think that's a very important part of what's going to happen moving forward. So definitely appreciate the insight there, Burj. Maybe Michael, I guess maybe what's your view as you look ahead towards this continued evolution of telecom networks? What do you see as maybe being one of the big challenges going forward for telecom operators?
Sure, Dan. Yeah, what I'm seeing is a lot of operators are in the assessment of NFV infrastructure itself. So they're figuring out, what compute platforms, what hypervisors, what vSwitch, I mean, they're kind of looking at these and they're looking at the vendors and trying to see who they're partnered with. So oftentimes they're turning to the vendor ecosystems like ALU Cloud Band or HP's OpenNFV, or Cisco has the UCS. So they're kind of looking at the vendor offerings and seeing what do they offer completely packaged, because at the end of the day, as much as they want open source based solutions, they do need vendors to supply it so they have a support system in place and ongoing development. Beyond that, the biggest challenges with the solution is really the gaps that we're seeing in the MANO side of things. And so, as I was saying, provisioning is at a decent state, but ongoing management like service assurance, resource management, the ability to deliver and monitor QoS and SLAs, this is where there's lots of challenge, because the current technology is built for multi-tenancy cloud. It's not built for network function virtualization, which has a great dependency on input-output parameters. And so the overarching infrastructure has to be much more aware of what the compute platform can deliver. And so that's where it's from I'd say a standards, they're kind of, and/or a solution, they're a little bit gapped.
Interesting. Yeah, and that seems like they're really tapping kind of the need for really like real-time analytics, basically, to really make sure the operators know what's happening in real time and are able to really, I guess, react to that in real time as well. Because it's in the past, near real time was probably okay, but it seems like with this new move, it seems like real time is really the key for making this platform move forward.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you have the real time of provisioning, which again is relatively there. Yeah. But if you want to do dynamic scale up or down based on demand and capacity, that requires that feedback system, understanding the resources available, understanding the demand coming in. That dynamic scale and other features they want from the platform aren't quite there for most services.
Interesting. Great. Well, maybe Alistair, maybe finish off with you with maybe getting your views on what you see as being maybe some of the big challenges, and to make it more difficult for you, you can't reference anybody's previous answer. So, again, new one for you. But if you have to, I guess you have to. But yeah, I guess what do you see going forward as being maybe some big challenges here?
Yep. So all of the above, and I would say, I think there's also there's a big training challenge. It's a lot of companies on the vendor side and the software development side are very focused on this. It's an inevitable shift in the business overall. But I think within the carrier side, there's a major shift in terms of what it means to actually live on a virtualized infrastructure and take advantage of that, and how do they make that shift? How do they coexist with their existing more physical environment today? So I think there's a lot of skill needed there, as well as they want to avoid vendor lock-in, which somewhat implies that they're going for a much more systems integration capability on their own, building that architecture. They're no longer just following a kind of Telcordia, Bellcore prescribed architecture or a 3GPP architecture for implementation. They're truly looking to integrate these components and take a large architectural ownership for what that final system looks like. And that, that's a major initiative. I mean, these are big systems, and doing that whilst running the existing physical network and bringing the two together is a big, complex challenge.
Yeah, interesting point there. I know speaking with AT&T has been pretty vocal about it, but their domain program has seemed to have brought in a lot of new people into the space. So it does seem like operators are looking to branch out from the normal traditional vendor community to bring in new players here. So obviously that's a big part of it. And like you said, the training aspect. I know, again, speaking with AT&T on that was something they mentioned was this is definitely a big shift for the company. I mean, this is not just a technology shift; it's an organizational shift, really, and how they approach their network going forward. And so, yeah, like you said, I mean, the training of the people, bringing on new people, obviously with new skill sets, but also training your current employees. That's going to be a huge part of this evolution towards virtualization. It seems like that's going to be a big move for these operators moving forward. So interesting to see how that plays out. Yeah. Well, very good. Well, we're just about out of time here. I think we got to most of the questions that were sent in. But again, if you do have some questions for our panel members on this, you can definitely still send those in, and we'll share those with our panel members for some potential follow-up afterwards. Also want to let everybody know that this webinar will be available for replay on our website, hopefully the next couple of hours. So you can go to the rcrwireless.com site and check out the replay there. Let's see, do I have any more slides here to show? Oh, there we go. Oh, yeah. I also want to reference, again, we do have a story or a report on this coming out that should be on our website hopefully later on today, as well as some insight on the space. And again, as I did the story, did the report, this is a topic that it does seem like we're probably still in the early phases of it. Obviously, our panel members have mentioned this already, but it's an evolving space and something that probably will need to be followed on a regular basis. I'm sure we'll be doing some more stories and maybe some more webinars on this topic going forward, just because it's a very new topic, I think, for the telecom space. And like I said, it seems like it's changing every week, every day. I know some of our panel members are at events as we speak where new announcements are coming out when it comes to virtualization. So definitely a topic that is evolving rapidly in the telecom space and something we'll keep an eye on going forward. But again, I want to thank our panel members today, Burj Abazian, who is with Wireless 2020, Michael Howe, who's with Ixia, and Alistair Scott, who's with JDSU, for great insight today. Thanks, guys, again for the great information today. We appreciate it. And with that, we will wrap up the webinar. And again, like I said, feel free to send those questions here at the last second, and we'll get those shared with our panel members. But again, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate it.